The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses, each a mirror of the other with their neat lawns and picket fences, basked in the warm glow of the early spring evening. In one such house, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the air, mingling with the scent of fresh herbs from the garden just outside the window. Sarah, an elementary school teacher with a heart as big as her smile, hummed softly to herself. Her hands moved deftly, a testament to years of perfecting her culinary skills. She glanced at the clock on the wall, noting with mild irritation that Mark was late again. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. But the gnawing feeling in her stomach was hard to ignore. Mark, her husband of 10 years, was a financial analyst with an ambitious streak. His late nights had become more frequent, often excused by tight deadlines and demanding clients. Sarah had always trusted him implicitly, but lately she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She caught herself staring at her reflection in the kitchen window, her brows knitted in a frown. Just then, the door opened and Mark walked in, loosening his tie as he entered. "Hey, sorry I'm late," he said, planting a quick kiss on her cheek. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding hers. Sarah forced a smile. "Long day at work?" "Yeah, you know how it is?" he replied, his voice slightly strained. He washed his hands at the sink, his back to her. "Deadlines piling up." She nodded, though her mind was far from convinced. They sat down to dinner, and while Mark talked about his day, Sarah found herself drifting into thoughts of their past. She remembered the early days of their marriage, filled with laughter and late-night talks. The memories were bittersweet now, overshadowed by the growing distance between them. After dinner, Sarah cleaned up while Mark retreated to his study. She watched him disappear behind the closed door, a barrier that seemed more symbolic than physical. With a sigh, she picked up her phone and sent a quick message to Emma, her sister-in-law. Emma arrived shortly after, her presence like a burst of sunlight in the dimly lit living room. She was vibrant, her personality magnetic. They settled on the couch with glasses of wine, catching up on each other's lives. Emma, a freelance graphic designer, had always been the life of the party. But tonight, there was a hint of sadness in her eyes, masked by her usual exuberance. "James has been so distant lately," she confessed, swirling her wine. "I feel like I'm losing him." Sarah's heart ached for her. James, Mark's older brother, was the dependable one, the rock of the family. The idea of him being anything less than perfect was hard to reconcile. "I'm sure it's just a phase," Sarah offered, trying to be comforting. "Relationships go through rough patches." Emma nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "I hope so. It's just, sometimes I feel so alone." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As Emma left, Sarah promised herself that she would talk to Mark about spending more time together, about reconnecting. She needed to know that their marriage wasn't slipping away from her grasp. Later that night, as Sarah lay in bed, Mark sighed empty and cold. She stared at the ceiling, thoughts swirling in her mind. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock, each second amplifying her worries. She closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, but the seeds of suspicion had been planted, and their roots were starting to spread. Mark eventually slipped into bed, careful not to wake her. He turned away, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his phone. Sarah pretended to be asleep, her heart heavy with doubt. What was he hiding? The question lingered in the darkness, unanswered and unsettling. As dawn approached, Sarah knew that her life was on the brink of change. The serene facade of their suburban life was beginning to crack, and beneath it lay secrets that could shatter everything. She resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, unaware that the journey she was about to embark on would lead to the unraveling of everything she held dear. And so the seeds of suspicion took root, setting the stage for a story of betrayal and heartache, where the lines between loyalty and deceit would blur, and the true strength of family bonds would be tested. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the bedroom. Sarah woke up feeling restless, the events of the previous night still heavy on her mind. She reached over to Mark's side of the bed, finding it empty. With a sigh, she pushed herself up and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Mark already dressed for work. "Morning," she said, forcing a smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," Mark replied, glancing at her briefly before returning to his phone. He was engrossed in an email, his brow furrowed with concentration. Sarah watched him for a moment, the familiar pang of doubt creeping in. She shook it off, deciding to focus on her own day. After all, today was the school's spring festival, and she had a lot to prepare. As the morning wore on, Sarah busied herself with festival preparations, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mark. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. During a brief break, she found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, reminiscing about the early days of their relationship. The love in Mark's eyes back then was undeniable, but now, that spark seemed to have dimmed. Later that afternoon, as she was helping set up the festival booths, her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Can you come over later? I need to talk," it read. Sarah's heart sank. She quickly replied, "Of course, I'll be there after the festival." The day passed in a blur of laughter and activities, but Sarah couldn't fully enjoy it. The weight of Emma's message lingered in the back of her mind. As soon as the festival ended, she made her way to Emma's house, her heart pounding with anxiety. Emma greeted her at the door, her usually bright demeanor replaced with a somber expression. They settled in the living room, the air thick with tension. "What's going on, Emma?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. Emma took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "It's James. I think he's seeing someone else." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The revelation was like a punch to the gut. "What makes you think that?" Emma wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "He's been distant, working late, and I found this," she said, handing Sarah a receipt for a dinner at a fancy restaurant, dated on a night James claimed to be working late. Sarah felt a surge of anger and sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Emma. Have you confronted him about it?" Emma shook her head. "I can't. I'm too scared of what he'll say. What if he confirms it? I don't know what I'll do." Sarah took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve to know the truth, Emma. You can't live like this." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. I'll talk to him tonight." As Sarah left Emma's house, she felt a strange sense of solidarity. Both women were grappling with the possibility of infidelity, their lives seemingly mirrored in their turmoil. When she arrived home, she found Mark's phone on the kitchen counter, his screen lit up with a notification. Curiosity and suspicion gnawed at her. She picked up the phone, her heart racing. As she scrolled through his messages, her world began to crumble. There, in black and white, were the suggestive texts between Mark and Emma. The words blurred before her eyes, each one a dagger to her heart. "Can't wait to see you tonight," read one message from Emma. "Miss you already," replied Mark. Sarah's hands trembled as she put the phone down, her mind reeling. How could they do this to her? To James? The betrayal was like a heavy weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stumbled to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Every memory, every shared moment, now tainted by deceit. The trust she had in her husband and sister-in-law shattered in an instant. Hours passed in a blur, the house grew dark, the silence deafening. When Mark finally returned home, he found Sarah sitting in the living room, her eyes red and puffy. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. Sarah looked at him, her heart breaking all over again. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark's face paled. "What about?" "About us, about Emma," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Mark sat down, his eyes wide with shock. "Sarah, I can explain." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice stronger now. "I saw the messages, Mark. I know everything." Mark's shoulders slumped, defeat etched into his features. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." Sarah looked at him, her heart torn between love and betrayal. "How could you do this to me? To our family?" Mark had no answer. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. As the night wore on, Sarah knew that her life was forever changed. The seeds of suspicion had grown into a painful reality, and now she was faced with an impossible choice. Confronting the truth was just the beginning. What came next would test her strength, her resolve, and her very sense of self. Sarah stared into the darkness, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Sarah's discovery were a blur of confusion and pain. The suburban neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and friendly facades, seemed to mock her with its serenity. Inside her home, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Each room felt like a trap, filled with memories now tainted by betrayal. Sarah moved through her days like a ghost, her mind constantly replaying the discovery. At school, she struggled to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor. Her students sensed her distraction, their curious eyes watching her with a mixture of confusion and concern. The spring festival had been a brief distraction, but now, the weight of her secret threatened to crush her. One evening, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table grading papers, Mark walked in. His presence was like a dark cloud, heavy and foreboding. He cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Sarah, we need to talk." She looked up, her eyes weary. "There's nothing left to say, Mark. You and Emma." Her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I messed up, but we need to figure out what happens next." Sarah's anger flared. "What happens next? You destroyed everything, Mark. How do we move on from that?" He sat down across from her, his eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what I was thinking. Can we try to work this out? For us? For the kids?" The mention of their children brought a fresh wave of pain. She thought of their innocent faces, oblivious to the turmoil ripping their family apart. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," she whispered. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Sarah opened the door to find Emma standing there, her face a mix of anxiety and remorse. "Can we talk?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The tension in the room was palpable as Emma sat down at the table. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for this to happen." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "How many times are you going to say that? Sorry doesn't fix this." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, I don't know how to make things right." "You can't," Sarah said coldly. "You both ruined everything." Just then, the door opened again and James walked in, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "Hey everyone, what's going on here? Having a little family meeting without me?" His jovial tone cut through the tension like a knife. Emma quickly wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. "Just catching up, James." James looked between the three of them, his brow furrowing slightly. "Everything all right?" Sarah forced a smile. "Just some family stuff. Nothing to worry about." James laughed, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. "All right then, how about we all have dinner together? It's been a while since we had a proper family meal." Mark and Emma exchanged a quick, nervous glance. "Sure, sounds good?" Mark said, his voice tight. The dinner that night was a strained affair. Sarah picked at her food, barely listening to the conversation around her. James, oblivious to the underlying tension, chatted animatedly about his day at work and upcoming plans for a family vacation. Sarah's heart ached as she watched him, his trust and happiness standing in stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the empty plates in front of her. The dinner had been a strained affair, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavily in the air. Across the table, Mark and Emma exchanged uneasy glances, their guilt palpable. Only James seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting animatedly about his plans for a family vacation. After dinner, Sarah and James said their goodbyes and headed home. The drive was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah's mind raced with the impending confrontation, while James, still in the dark, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they pulled into the driveway, James turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Sarah, is everything okay? You seemed distant tonight?" Sarah forced a smile, her heart heavy with the burden of her secret. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long day." James nodded, but the worry in his eyes remained. All right, let's get some rest. Inside, they prepared for bed in silence. As James slipped under the covers, he couldn't help but wonder what had caused the palpable tension between Mark, Emma, and Sarah. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as Sarah turned off the light and settled beside him. In the darkness, the weight of unspoken truths pressed down on them both. For Sarah, the night was a restless one, filled with the dread of the inevitable confrontation. For James, it was a night of confusion and unease, his instincts telling him that something was deeply wrong. The fragile piece of their suburban life hung by a thread, ready to unravel with the dawn of the new day. The truth was a ticking time bomb, and when it finally exploded, it would change everything. The morning sun streamed through the bedroom window, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah lay awake, her mind churning with anxiety. The tension between her and Mark had reached a breaking point, and Emma's resolve to tell James weighed heavily on her. Today was the day everything would change. Downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the air. James was already up, bustling around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Sarah forced herself out of bed, knowing she couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. As she entered the kitchen, James greeted her with a warm smile. "Morning, Sarah. I made your favorite, pancakes and fresh strawberries." Sarah managed a weak smile, her stomach churning with dread. "Thanks, James." They sat down to eat, the usual morning chatter replaced with a heavy silence. Sarah picked at her food, her mind elsewhere. James noticed her distraction, his brow furrowing with concern. "Sarah, are you sure everything's all right? You've been so distant lately." Before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "I'll get it," she said, hurrying to the door. She opened it to find Emma standing there, her face pale and drawn.
"Are you ready?" Emma asked, her voice trembling.
Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's do this." They walked into the living room where James was cleaning up the breakfast dishes. He looked up, surprised to see Emma. "Hey, Emma, everything okay?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "James, we need to talk. It's about Mark and me." James looked between the two women, confusion etched on his face. "What's going on?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "James, there's something you need to know. Mark and Emma, they've been having an affair." The room fell into a deafening silence. James stared at them, disbelief and anger mingling in his eyes. "What did you say?"
Emma's eyes filled with tears. "It's true, James. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." James's face turned red with rage. "How could you? How could both of you do this to us? To our family?" Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but she knew this confrontation was necessary. "I found out a few days ago. I didn't know how to tell you."
James clenched his fists, his whole body trembling. "And Mark? Where is he?" As if on cue, the front door opened, and Mark walked in. He froze when he saw the scene in front of him. "What's going on?" James advanced towards him, fury blazing in his eyes. "How could you betray me like this? How could you do this to your own family?" Mark's face paled. "James, I can explain." "Explain!" James roared. "There's nothing to explain. You slept with my wife. You destroyed everything." Emma stepped forward, trying to calm him. "James, please, let's talk about this." But James was beyond reason. "Talk? You want to talk after what you've done? Get out of my house, both of you." Mark and Emma exchanged a desperate glance. "James, we need to work this out. For the kids," Mark pleaded. James shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "There's nothing left to work out. You betrayed me, both of you. Get out." Sarah watched in silence, her heart breaking for her brother-in-law. Emma and Mark slowly walked out, leaving James standing there, shattered and alone. The room felt emptier, the silence heavier than ever. James sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Sarah approached him cautiously, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "James, I'm so sorry." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. "How do we move on from this, Sarah? How do we even begin to heal?" Sarah wished she had the answers. "We take it one day at a time. It's going to be hard, but we'll get through this together." The rest of the day passed in a haze. James retreated to his room, leaving Sarah to manage the aftermath. She called the kids, explaining as best she could that their parents needed some time apart. Their confused and tearful responses broke her heart all over again. As evening fell, Sarah found James sitting on the porch staring into the distance. She sat down beside him, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel so lost." Sarah reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're all lost right now, but we'll find our way. It's going to take time, but we'll heal." James nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "Thank you for being here, Sarah. I don't think I could get through this without you." Sarah smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll get through this together, one step at a time." The fragile piece of their suburban life had been shattered, the truth exploding with devastating force. The road to healing was long and uncertain, but Sarah and James knew they had to walk it together. The bonds of family had been tested, and now it was time to rebuild, piece by broken piece. The morning after the confrontation dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself mourned the fracture in their family. Sarah woke up with a heavy heart, the events of the previous day replaying in her mind like a relentless loop. She glanced over at James, who was still asleep, his face etched with lines of sorrow even in rest. Determined to keep moving forward, Sarah got out of bed and went downstairs. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual bustle of family life. She busied herself in the kitchen, making coffee and setting out breakfast, hoping the routine might provide some semblance of normalcy. James appeared in the doorway, his expression tired but resolute. "Morning?" he mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Morning," Sarah replied softly. "I made coffee. Thought you might need it." He gave her a weak smile. "Thanks. I don't think I slept at all." They sat in silence, sipping their coffee. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a sense of solidarity. They were in this together, navigating the wreckage of their lives side by side. "What's our plan?" James asked eventually, breaking the silence. "How do we even begin to pick up the pieces?" Sarah took a deep breath. "First, we need to take care of the kids. They need to know that we're here for them, no matter what." James nodded. "I'll call Emma later and arrange a time to talk to them. They deserve to hear it from both of us." The day passed in a haze of phone calls and quiet conversations. James spoke to Emma, arranging for her to come over in the evening. Sarah called Mark, her voice trembling as she explained that they needed time apart. Mark agreed, his voice filled with regret and sorrow. By the time evening fell, the house felt like a battleground. Emma arrived, her face pale and drawn. The children sensed something was wrong and clung to their parents, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Sitting together in the living room, James and Emma gently explained the situation to the kids. Their reactions ranged from tears to anger, their young minds struggling to comprehend the betrayal. Sarah watched, her heart breaking anew with each tear that fell. "We'll get through this," James assured them, his voice steady despite his own turmoil. "It's going to be hard, but we're still a family. We'll figure it out together." As the kids were tucked into bed, Sarah and James stood in the hallway, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Emma left quietly, her eyes filled with regret and sorrow. Mark had agreed to stay away, giving everyone the space they needed to heal. The next few weeks were a blur of counseling sessions, tearful conversations, and attempts to find a new normal. Sarah and Mark attended therapy separately, both struggling to understand how their marriage had unraveled. Emma and James did the same, their sessions filled with raw emotion and tentative steps towards forgiveness. One afternoon, Sarah found herself in the park, watching the children play. The sound of their laughter was bittersweet, a reminder of the innocence that had been shattered. James joined her, his presence a comforting anchor. "It's been a rough few weeks," he said, sitting down beside her, "but I think we're starting to see some progress." Sarah nodded, her eyes on the children. "It's going to take time, but we're getting there." James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about taking it one day at a time. It's hard, but it's the only way we're going to get through this. She smiled, her heart warming at his words. We'll get through this, James, one step at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the wounds began to heal. The family slowly adjusted to their new reality, finding moments of joy amidst the pain. Sarah and Mark worked on rebuilding their trust, their sessions filled with honest conversations and heartfelt apologies. James and Emma did the same, their bond growing stronger with each step towards forgiveness. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Sarah and James found themselves on the porch, a quiet moment of peace between them. "I never thought we'd get to this point," James said to his sister-in-law, his voice filled with wonder. "I thought the betrayal would destroy us." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting the golden hues of the sunset. "It almost did. But we're stronger than we think, and we have each other." Grateful for the support she received over the past few weeks from her brother-in-law, James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for being there for me, Sarah. I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "We got through this together, James, and we'll keep moving forward one day at a time." The fragile piece of their suburban life began to take root once more. The truth had exploded with devastating force, but in its aftermath, a new beginning had emerged. The road to healing was long and uncertain, but with each step they grew stronger, their bonds of family and friendship deeper than ever before.